I want to introduce myself real quick. I'm Lauren Apicella, Head of Alumni Relations for Georgetown McDonough, and I want to thank you guys for attending today's webinar, Excel for Finance, as part of our new series of Skills Days, which provides both students and alumni the opportunity to learn skills that are not necessarily taught in courses right now, but are still vital to the changing nature of the workplace. So I do want to introduce this evening's teacher, Ariona Prifty, who is our CFO at Georgetown McDonough, along with her teammates, Greg and Jurgen. Again, we're really excited that you guys are able to attend this evening. Thank you all for your time, and Ariona, all yours.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I wish we would be welcoming you back on campus, hopefully very soon. It's very good to see you all. I am also an alumni myself. I'm a graduate of the Executive MBA program. And I can't tell if there's any alumni here. If you are, hello. I will introduce you to my team. So I oversee the finances at the School of Business. And Jurgen and Greg are also part of the finance team. We use Excel, every day. In fact, we think it's probably the most important thing in life on some days. So we will be sharing with you a couple of topics today, or how we approach them. And then if we have any questions, I will share those very shortly. I'll let Greg and Yuri introduce themselves very quickly, and then we can get started. Greg?
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Frazier. As Aaron as well, I'm an alumni of Georgetown. I'm not actually for the business school. I'm for the School of Continuing Services. I have a master's in technology management. So I got a little of a business background and a tech background, and with my finance and Georgetown, it was an awesome blend. But like I said, this is a perfect opportunity to give us a little bit more skills towards Excel, and have us a bit more of a lab exercise and thoughts so we can get some little expertise while we all have a little bit extra time on our hands.
Hi everyone, my name is Jurgen, and I work with Greg and Ariona in overseeing finances for MSB, and I'm also attending the Executive MBA program, and it's very excited to be on the professor side tonight.
Okay, I will be sharing my screen. I know I think all of you should have filled out a survey checking off whether you knew the very basic entry-level Excel skills in order to complete today's exercises. The way we thought we'd approach this, we have an Excel spreadsheet that we want you to download. What we're going to cover today is you'll take away a lot more if you're actually doing the exercises with us. We're going to explain what we're going to do and then break out into in breakout rooms. And then each of us will be joining the breakout rooms and then help you solve the exercise after we show you how to do it. And then we're also going to take any questions, and whether you have questions on how does this relate to work that, maybe your own jobs. I'm going to share very quickly. So sorry if you can see my screen. This is also uploaded in the Google Drive file that Greg will share the link very shortly on our chat. This is our contact information if you have any questions later on, whether it's during class or after. And then these are the topics that we're going to cover. We're going to presenter mode because I don't know how big are your screens that you're seeing. So if you are very familiar with these, then perhaps we can offer another time a more advanced Excel course. But for today, we're going to talk about conditional formatting, specialized functions. There's a couple of formulas here that we use quite frequently. Nested functions, how to set up a pivot table and how to build a pivot chart from that pivot table. We're going to go over the payments and loan amortization, how to set up one, how to use the 1 and 2 variable tables, and then how to use GoalSeek. And then at the end of all of these, we'll take some questions from you. I will stop sharing now. Greg, were you able to send the link out?
Yep, just send the link to everyone. Everyone should have viewing access to it. So if everyone looks at the bottom of their Zoom, you should see a chat from me, giving you right to that Google Drive folder. And
if you're unable to download that spreadsheet, let us know. We can always email it to you.
And if you're not able to actually, let's say you're on an iPad of some sort, you're not able to do any of these downloads, that's totally fine. We're going to go in some breakout rooms and go through some exercises. And if you actually just want to be a visual participant and go through that, that's totally fine. I think with Excel, if anyone's been familiar with finance, Excel, you need more hands-on. So if you have an opportunity to actually work on this, definitely recommend it. But you can actually get through this entire exercise and lab to class today with just being visual, if that's your preference.
One other thing to point out, we tried to select exercises that can be done in both Mac and non-Mac computers. To use Excel on Mac, you have to download Bootcamp typically to have all the features active. So we shouldn't have any issues, but just food for that. Okay, I have downloaded my spreadsheet. I don't see anyone here letting us know that they cannot download it. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Jürgen. He's going to cover the first two concepts that we listed.
Okay,
So
so
go ahead and share your screen if you want.
I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Okay. So do you all see this?
Yes, we do.
All right, so this is a very large database. It's like a made-up store. It's called Superstore, and it has all type of orders for like 5 years or 4 years. And it has the shipping date, the order date, the ship mode, customer name, customer ID, customer name. It has a city, a state, a postal code. So we can play around with this database however we want and whatever our interest is to explore. So I'm going to talk today about what an Excel function is, which is a formula that simplifies a complex calculation. And we're going to talk today about if functions and nested functions, which are functions inserted as an argument to another function. And we're also going to talk about Vlookups, which Vlookup is a very popular formula, which help us in finding in a table, in finding a value, and returns the result from the related column. So to make this more understandable for you, let me give us an example. So let me start with a Vlookup. So do you all have this this spreadsheet? I guess yes. Okay. So let me, since you have this and you have like an exercise that you can practice later, I'm going to choose something. Let's choose quantity. Okay, so we're gonna look for quantity for all these orders in this huge database we have. Okay, so let's start. So every formula should start with an equal in front. So we're gonna write Vlookup, and we're gonna give a value to this formula, which is this this cell right here on the left. And after we give a value, we're gonna hit a comma, and then we're gonna find the table. So we're gonna go back to the database, and we're gonna select all these columns from the order ID, which we have in there, until the quantity. Okay, and then after every time we select something, we click the comma to go to another column index that is required. So we're going to count all these columns to put it here. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, right? So we're gonna put number 17, which is column 17, and we can check true or false. But in this case, we want the exact match, which we're gonna choose the false. We're gonna close the bracket, and here we go. We have 4 items sold for this order ID. And now if we want to choose, to choose the whole for all these order IDs we have, we're gonna just double click on this, and we have all the numbers. So somehow we don't have this order ID. We got an error here. Let's see. So I guess we don't have an order ID with that number. We can do this with everything, with sales, with quantity, with we can add another column to see. Okay. To see how it looks if we gonna. So let's see what product we're gonna see the product name. So let's see how this formula find us the product name. Not just a value, but a name. So again, equal Vlookup. And then we're gonna look up for this, and then comma, and then we go to the table. And again, start from what we're looking for, so the order ID, to the product. And this is column 15. So we're gonna put, I didn't put the comma. We're gonna put the 15, and again, false, and close the brackets. So we can see that this order ID has this product name. And let's see for everyone. So we have all the products by the order ID. Does anyone have any questions? No. Okay, I was just checking to the chat. Oh, I'm sorry. Thomas said too small to see. Is this good?
Yeah, it's better.
All right. Sorry about that.
Actually, let us know, because we're using very big screens.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's a question. So Yuri, I'll read the question to you. Do you have any best practices regarding not imputing that actual column number and having a reference instead? So in the VLOOKUP formula.
So a reference, I don't understand.
So instead of counting the formulas, Bernard, I'm assuming that's what you mean. Instead of counting the columns to determine which column it is. Yes. Okay. If you select the column, it's actually, if you keep pulling to the right, it'll show you. So maybe Yuri, if you want to illustrate sales.
So if I do this, so you don't have to count it, but wait. If I do this, you can see on the left of my screen, when the B column is, it says 12C, which is 12 columns. So you don't have to count those. You just.
Can you point with your cursor? It's actually very small. I'm not sure everyone can see it. So right under A1.
So if I let go, it disappears. That's the problem.
I see. Okay.
Zoom into this one a little bit, Yuri. Maybe if you zoom into this one, we can see a bit more from that one.
So when you highlight it, it shows the number of columns you need to put.
Yeah.
I think from Bernard, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're looking for, is there a way for us to use this VLOOKUP and not have to actually put a number in that part when we're doing the columns? Is that, yep. So unfortunately, that's one of the limitations with VLOOKUP. So it's real informative that, you can choose your data set and then tell Excel smart, tell Excel to go to column 5 and get the data from there. But unfortunately, Excel can't think as much there. So you gotta at least tell it the column number. There are a few other functions that have the same comparison to VLOOKUP, like an index and match. I talk to my coworkers a lot. I love index and match function, but it's a little bit complicated. It's tough to talk about and actually walk through, but that will probably be the only type of formula that will still give you the same answer as like a VLOOKUP without having to do a column number. So I guess to answer your question, so the best practice is we have to use that column number. Maybe once everything's finished, we can give you some alternatives, and hopefully if we have a follow-up lab with this, we can go into the next step. So now that we talked about VLOOKUPs, next class or next lab, we can actually do a index and match.
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback on Greg's explanation, so we're talking about too many stuff tonight. So the problem is that we cannot go in very detail. I mean, we can talk about this whole day if we have the time, but we don't really have time to go in detail. So this is like the first time we're doing this, so we will learn through this process, and maybe we can focus only on 1 or 2 topics to talk more about these topics.
There's a question on clarifying what the VLOOKUP output gives us. So quite often, if you're working with very large data sets, in order for the VLOOKUP to work, or rather you would employ VLOOKUP when merging data sets, but you're not merging all components of the data set, rather you're pulling only the ones that are useful to you. And for VLOOKUP to work, you would need a common denominator between both of these 2 data sets, which in our case, we're using order ID. So what we're using it for in this case is we have a data dump rather of the sales of this superstore. And now we're trying to narrow it down. So, and there's a couple of ways to get there. And I think in the next few moments, you will see another way to get the same results. But a pivot table, for example, is another way to do this. We could subtotal with specifically here, what we're saying is, I want with the order ID serving as my common denominator, I'd like to pull only certain information. And we have narrowed it down to quantity, product name, sales, and product subcategory. It could be anything, but the use of VLOOKUP would be between very large data sets. You're looking specifically only for certain components of one data set to be merged with the other, and you employ VLOOKUP. So for example, a very basic use in the class that I teach. There's grades that download from the system, and then there's each grade has the student's name and then their GUID. And then I have to upload the grades back, but I only have, not upload them back, let's see, maybe that was not a good example. Whatever downloads from one system and what downloads from another, the common denominator is only the GUID. And so in order for me to pull the grades of one student into a file that only has their GUID but not their name, and I want the names to show, then I'd merge these 2 files using the VLOOKUP function. I don't know if Greg wants to chime in with.
No, that's a great comparison. And one of the things I mean, I probably don't have any other steps with that one, but probably the only thing I took whenever I mention these types of functions or VLOOKUPs is that this is one way to get an answer. So for a VLOOKUP, using this lookup function, it's a real useful way, but it's almost a manual way. When we go to our next exercise variant and you do pivot tables, almost everything that you use to do a VLOOKUP, you could use that with a pivot table. And
with pivot tables.
Pivot tables are our bread and butter. I think there isn't any data set that we don't do without making a pivot table, because almost all these functions that we create, that pivot table does everything. I mean, the name pivot inside pivot table is the fact that you can reformat your data to see however your output is. So if you're looking at this VLOOKUP function and you're like, it seems really manual. It seems like I have to put in I have to know the order ID and know the column number to make this formula. You're exactly right. So VLOOKUPs are it's a useful tool, but it's a useful tool really for a limited amount of data. If you're getting a really, really large set of data, then a pivot table will be the best benefit for you.
Okay. So let's go back to this data, and we're gonna try to create an if function. So what an if functions helps us for? So we have all these products, all these categories and prices and whatever. And let's see if we want to see whoever is discounted. And we don't want to see only by number, but we are creating a formula to give us a name. So again, a formula always starts with the equal sign, and we're gonna write if. And let's say we are looking for how many discounts we have, right? Or if we have discounts or not. So we're gonna say if this cell, right, is bigger than 0, then we're gonna put parentheses, and we're gonna enter the value if it is true. So if this is bigger than 0, then we have discount. All right, so we close the parentheses, and always we put comma after we wrote something. And we're gonna see now if this is smaller, I mean, if this is 0, so we don't have discount, right? So we're gonna put again okay. And we're gonna say no discount. We're gonna close the brackets. And we have here no discount. So let's drop this down. So here it appears that this is 0.1, so we had a discount. So the formula tells us that we have this discount. Here again, we can drop this down. And again, let's see further. So we don't have discounts. So far we don't have discounts. And we can drop this down and see for all these products, and we can use the filter function just to filter on discounts, right? And we're gonna see where we have discounts. I'm gonna select everything back. So we can use if functions, which are called nested formulas. We can use a more complex formula in here. So we're gonna say, let's use let's put 2 criteria, right? So we're gonna say if again the S2, which is the discount, is bigger or equal, let's say, to 0.5, then it's gonna be special discount. So in this case, we are finding only the special discounts, right? Okay, always comma after it. And we're gonna start another if formula after this. So we're gonna say, yeah, we can, I was looking at the chat, sorry. So Justin, can you modify the formula to also add a field? That would be a conditional formatting, which you can create like a color for a specific value or whatever you're looking for. A value, I mean, we are not going to talk about this, but I mean, we can definitely talk.
Actually, I mean, I think it's pretty quick if you want to show it under discount type area, just as an example. If it's discount, for example, let's color with one of the defaults. But once you finish this, if you'd like.
Yeah. Okay. Let me finish this first. So we said we started another if criteria. We're gonna say if this is bigger than 0, then we have a standard discount. And then we need to put always, if we don't have any of these criterias, which we need to write something, let's say no discounts, right? Okay, close the brackets. What have I done wrong? Oh, I didn't put, yeah, every time you need to put a comma after every criteria you put in there. Again, okay, so no discounts.
Maybe here it's a good time to share the use of the function bar, the FX up top. So you don't have to remember how to type all of these. The FX, can you click the function argument right above P FX?
Where is that again?
In your address bar to the right, to the left, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Right next to the address bar is an FX, and that basically is the function where we can, that'll basically walk us through the entire one.
Okay, I don't see it.
Actually, you taught me something here earlier, so it is.
Oh,
right
yeah. Yeah, okay.
Yep. And this, and to explain to everyone, this is, we're so used to using Excel that we can go right into the cell and put in our formula. But you may be a scenario where you're like, I don't know where to start. And with Excel, they do have the spots there where they say, you see both of each of the parameters, but Excel is actually, it helps you walk through a lot. So clicking through this action bar where it will actually walk you through the entire process. It'll let you know, where's your first logical test? What do you want it to say if it's true? What do you want it to say if it's false? And this is great because if you're really new with Excel and you don't really understand where the commas and the parentheses and the quotation marks go, this helps you out here. And then once you get more used to it, you can run right into the cell. But with this one, I mean, if you need a little bit more of a, I'll say, quote unquote, training wheels, going to this functions argument is a great help for you to get used to specific functions.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is pretty much the nested formula as well, when we can use 2 or more criterias. I can show you if we want to use if and, which is again a nested function as well. But I think I'm consuming all our questions for the test. I mean, test, it's not a test, for exercise.
And actually, we can take your
How are we with the time?
So we are just about halfway through, and I think this is probably a good time to get everyone's feedback. Yeah. So our original plan was we would walk through a couple of exercises, and we would actually, try to use a breakout time so you can actually do some hands-on and we can do some one-on-one work with these things. If everyone feels okay, we can go to a breakout room for about 5 or 10 minutes and actually work on the remainder of these exercises. You can actually specifically, instead of walking through it with Jurgen, you can try it out yourself, and myself, Jurgen, or Ariona would be actually can go inside there. Or if everyone from a majority feels like, you know, maybe we can finish up with these couple of exercises and go to the next topic, we can do that one as well.
And we'll share the solution file in the end as well. So if you'd like to review this on your own after class is over, you can reference the solution file as well with the formulas. Can we set up a poll very quickly? And does anyone have the ability to see if we want to move on to pivot tables and pivot charts?
And I think looks like our poll's not that great. So if anyone, you can give me a at the bottom, you can do a reaction. If you want to stay on, you can give me a heart. If you want to move on to a pivot tables, thumbs up. I see pivots.
So thumbs up.
Pivot.
All right. Yuri, do you want to stop sharing and I'll share my
Sure.
screen?
All right, everyone, majority rules. We're going to talk about pivots now.
All right. Okay, so I'm working off of the same file. So the pivot chart, so we're going to talk about pivot charts, which will also reference the same data set, the Superstore sales. We're going to learn how to then regroup this data in a way that serves my intentions. And so as you receive, so as you're downloading a whole lot of information from whatever systems that you use, you're not going to need all of that. And so instead of going through filters and writing formulas to extract the information that you want, instead, we're going to employ pivot tables that are that can change continuously while reflecting only the information that you're interested in. I'll show you a couple. So I'll show you how you run the pivot tables, and then a couple of things that need to be in place for the pivot table to work, and how do you use them in a couple of scenarios. So these are the to-dos for this exercise. You can also run charts based off of a pivot table that we've already set up. And so that's the second part of this exercise. So we're going to first create a pivot table that shows the sales by segment, sales by consumer segment. So maybe this is a monthly report that you have to share with one of your stakeholders. And so the way to do this would be, the pivot table option is actually under the insert menu. So right next to home, you'd go to insert, and then you're going to see here pivot table. Once you click on this menu, this is the first option that you'll see, the create pivot table. You're going to select the table range, the range, so a table or a range. And this is where our data set is. So in other words, we have to go back to, and you don't have to necessarily click here, you can just go back to orders. And if you see here, now the range is referencing the tab that we're going to pull the information from. And you will select, either you can select the entire sheet. So just click this little corner between column A and row 1. Another way to select only, so if you want to see exactly how far your data runs, how far down, you can click on A1. Instead of using your cursor to drag down, because you may have thousands of rows, and I think we do here. Instead of doing that, you click on A1, and then you can use, so this only works, I'm not sure if it works on Mac computers, or rather, I don't know the shortcut, but on non-Mac computers, you would use Control-Shift at the same time, and then arrow down on your keyboard. And that will get you to the bottom of the very first column. So you'll see here we go all the way to row 10,001. From here, keep Control-Shift selected, and if you hit End, that'll take you to the very end of the data set. So now you're not concerned. All you want at this stage is to include all of your data points of the database. Once you're here, you're going to hit Enter. So of course, we're not done here with all the components, and so that's why we saw that little little message there. I'm going to go back to pivot charts. The second part that we have to answer here is, where do we want the pivot table to be placed? Typically, when we run a pivot table, you'd always select a new worksheet. In this case, just so that we can follow along with the instructions, I'm just going to select the existing worksheet, and I'm going to place my pivot table to begin on row 9, so the output of the data that I'm selecting. So I'm going to hit OK. Pivot name is not valid. Okay, so that is an error message that we would typically get if one of my labels is blank. And so in order to run a pivot table, so that's very common. In order to run a pivot table, every column that is included in the data in the range of the pivot table must have a label. So somewhere I must have had something that did not have a column name. So I'm going to rerun this. It's a pivot table. My range is my orders. And maybe this time, actually, I'm going to stop right on column T, right by profit. And I want, again, the output to start on A9. And so this is what we're going to see. So this is the very blank pivot table. From here, we're going to, the pivot table is very much like an iPhone where you download the apps that you want. Pivot table is very similar. So from here, we're going to select the information that we want. This exercise requires that we show sales by consumer segment. So you will notice if I click outside of this white range here, I don't know if you noticed up here, if I click inside, you'll see the pivot table tools. It's a new menu bar that has been active, that becomes active and visible now. And if you click on here, there's all the pivot table menu options that we're not going to see all of them, but we will see some today. If I click outside, then we no longer see that. So in order to activate that, make sure that you click inside the pivot table. This is your field list. If your screen is too tight, or when you're done with the pivot table and you no longer want to see this, you just uncheck it. You can either X out of here, or you click the field list button up here in the menu bar. From here, I'm going to select my sales and my consumer segment. So I'm going to start building now the components of my pivot table. So I'm going to find sales on this list. So here it is. You can just check it. And because sales is a column that contains numbers, the Excel is smart enough to put it immediately into values. So, and it's defaulting to sales. Typically, it'll either default to sales or sum. We do want sum. I think if we use any of these other features, which I'll show you in 1 second, it'll give us a different result. So for now, so let's select consumer segment. So I want to see the sales by consumer segment. So let's check consumer segment. And again, it's smart enough to put it into rows. The other thing that you can do, instead of checking it, you can just drag consumer segment to the box that you want. So now what the pivot table did, it summarized all of the data from orders into a very short summary of, I don't need to know anything else other than how did my consumer segments perform. You will notice here the formatting is off. You can go to the very, very quick way is you select these numbers and you just select your comma style format or the dollar sign, the dollar one, whichever one you're using. That is not my favorite method actually of formatting these numbers, because once we start playing around with the pivot table and add or subtract other fields, so for example, if I add region here, if you notice the formatting disappeared. And so instead what you would do is you would click once under on top of sum of sales, select value field settings. This is where, before we move to the number format, this is where you see the options of what can a pivot table do. These are some of the preset fields, sum, count, average, max, and all of these here. If you scroll down, we will also show here very quickly how to add a calculated field. If you don't want any of these here, but you want something else, and you know how to obtain that number, how do you add another calculated field? To format the number, just click on number format. And I'm going to select currency. I don't want to see decimal places because at this point my report is top level. So I'm going to click OK. And I added region here, but I will remove it now so I can illustrate the part 1. So I now have sales by consumer segment. Now let's say I'm looking at this and I think, wow, consumers, very large, I'd like to know more about it. So I'm now going to enter the subcategory. So again, you can either click here or you can drag that down. And so now I'm looking at my first division is consumers, and the second one is corporate. And this pivot table is formatted with some colors that I'm not too crazy about because I can't read the numbers. And so I'm going to change this. So if you go under, if you click within the pivot table, you go to pivot tools, you'll see the two tabs that are active now, Analyze and Design. Select Design, and here, if you go to the arrows to the right, you'll see the options of how many preset designs you have. And so you just select one of these. So let me pick. Okay, this one is easier to read. Okay. So now I can see my sales by consumer and then by subcategory. And maybe if I'm interested in just reviewing corporate at this point, you can use here the filter option. So I'm going to uncheck all of them and just select corporate. And now I have a very specific report. If I want to see all of them back, then I add it. Another way of formatting the pivot table in this case, perhaps I'd like to see my consumer segments in columns. So you just play around with this to see whether your data is showing the right way. So now I moved my consumer segment under columns, and now I'm seeing a grand total as well. You can actually do away with this column if you don't want it, but it typically defaults there. And so now I'm seeing the subcategories under columns and then my categories across. Okay. What's the next one? Okay, so we're going to add, okay. So here, if you notice, I swapped the two labels or the two fields that I've employed in this report. So now it's showing by subcategory, by consumer segment. All I wanted to show here is that you could trade whatever you have here in the order that you want. And you do that just by moving them up or down. We're adding the sales field value to determine the category that sold the most. Guys, help me out. What did we want to illustrate here? Are we filtering for sales or?
So for this one, you have the sales, and looks like for this exercise, we're looking to, we already have our subcategory, or do we have a subcategory here?
Yes, the accessories, appliances.
So I think for this one, we just want to see the most. So we can either go to the, we can sort the data so it sorts everything from the most. Because it's asked to determine the subcategory that sold the most, but it's not asking for the one that is the most. So I think the easiest
so
way
we
for
can
this
use
one,
value filters then?
Yep.
Okay. So then consumer segment for this, so since I'm only interested in seeing the subcategory that sold the most, the category here becomes a little bit irrelevant. So I don't want to get rid of it altogether. Instead, I'm just going to move it into filters. And when you see this message, that means, so filters is going to show up right up top of this pivot table. And so what this little message here says is that you already have data in these rows. We're going to have to move it down. So if that's now, typically, if you start a pivot table on a blank page, you won't see these messages. So before I do that, I'm going to insert a couple of rows here so that I have enough space to employ the filters option as well. So I'm going to move the consumer segment here, and I'm going to leave the subcategory. Now, from what we can tell here, these are not ranked in order. And so we're going to use value filters to find the one that sold the most. So let's do top 10. But it did not sort them. So let's sort them instead. Okay, so we can clear the filter and then let's sort. My sales are not sorting. Why is that?
You can sort on the number by right clicking the one number and go sort.
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry. Okay. So let's sort largest to smallest. Okay, so now you can see the chairs. All right. And then if I add the customer segment, you can still add the customer segment back in here. Within each customer segment, we now have the subcategories, and they're sorted now within their own subcategory. Okay. All right, from here, I'm going to move customer segment up so we can actually have a smaller pivot table. Okay, we're going to calculate, we're going to add a calculated field to determine the profit margin. So if we notice here under values, that's where I mentioned that we already have the preset formulas. So if we go to field settings, these are all the formulas that Excel has made available, but it doesn't have a profit one. And so we can add another column right next to sales, or you can replace sales if we wanted to. And in our case, we're going to calculate the profit margin. So I'm going to click on the pivot table. So I see the pivot table tools menu. Right under analyze, go a little bit to the right, you're going to see fields, items, and sets. You can click on there, and the very first option is calculated field. Once that opens up, first we're going to have to give it a name. What do we want this field to be? So let's call this profit margin. And the formula, we're going to divide profit by sales. And you have to choose from existing fields from your database. So you cannot you cannot add anything at this point. So it has to be existing fields. So we're going to find profit here. There's profit. Divide that by sales. To select these, you either select sales and check insert fields, or you can double click on this label. And then you click OK. And now the sum of profit margin is showing here. Now the formatting here is wrong, or it's not wrong, but if you want to turn it into percentage, you click on sum of profit margin, go to value field settings, select your number format, and select here %, and select OK. One good thing of the pivot table is that you don't have to select all of the cells. It'll apply whatever command you're giving to the entire set of data within the pivot table. Okay, from here, so am I in the consumer segment? Subcategory here. Okay, from here, we can now create a chart to see this data. So depending on who your audience is, you can give them a report. You can give them this pivot table and say, here's the information along with your analysis. Or you can use a visual tool. Charts are a very popular one, where you could say, here's the trend analysis that I'm noticing, and here's illustrated for someone to review it very quickly. So under pivot table tools, the analyze menu, you will see the pivot chart. If you're, again, remember to click inside the pivot table to see this active. So if you click under pivot chart, you now have a lot of options here on what we want to see. We are selecting the combo chart. And let's pick the clustered column one. So again, since there's a print preview here, and if you've used charts before, you're probably playing around with this to see which one works for you. And then we click OK. A little bit tight, but here's your chart. And like with any other chart that you're running, you take a look at it to see, is this chart actually making the point that you want it to make? And so the profit for certain items, even though there's a lot of sales, the profit is not necessarily great. And so there's a lot of expenses correlated with the sales of chairs, for example, it seems. So that is the pivot tables and charts for pivots. And before we move on, I haven't looked at the chat at all. I'm not sure if there's any questions. Any questions, Yuri, Greg, that you can
No. I mean, Greg responded to one question.
We have a few questions. So if you still had the questions on selecting the pivot table data, let me know. We can go through that part again. And if any still has a question on where the design and analyze part comes up, give me a raised hand and we can go over that part again. But if any questions regarding just pivot tables in general, feel free to bring them in right now. I mean, we're not going to finish up. I mean, we're not going to stop anytime soon, but we're going to go to a next topic, and we can still ask any other pivot table things. But
and Greg and Yuri, chime in if you know any tips and tricks that I forgot to share. The chart option is if you click, so again, you have to click on the pivot table to see any options tied to the pivot table features that Excel offers. Click anywhere in here, you will see the pivot table tools activated right above Power Pivot. So I'm just pointing to it now. And then under Analyze, the pivot chart is towards the right. So I'm hovering over it now. And another thing to mention here is as you change the pivot table, the chart will change along with it. And so, for example, let's say, I'm going to remove the consumer segment. So I thought let's just say my chart is too busy and it's not really making the point that I want. So why don't we look at just the subcategory of the products that I'm selling and then the profitability of each of those products? Then this may make a better point than the previous chart. And so you can play around with this every time that you change it. So if you captured this already and you want to run another chart, you'd have to run another pivot table actually. So if you like this chart, but you also want to see sales by region, that could be another one. If I add region here and I remove subcategory, if you see everything is changing along. So one trick that, I mean, it's not really a trick, but one way that we do it is we replicate the same pivot table. And to do this, I don't know if you or Greg have any other shortcuts here, but you would just copy this pivot table, perhaps, let's say over here. And now the changes that I'm making to this pivot table will not impact this one. But they share the same database. And so on this one, I'm going to go back to subcategory. I lost subcategory, there it is. So I'll leave this one as subcategory. And then on this one, I want to see my sales and the profit margin by region. You can also, again, you can do a chart here as well. So just click on that pivot table, go to Analyze, Pivot Chart, and then pick the chart that actually reflects the point that you're trying to make. I picked the same type of chart. And so now I have two charts. You can move these around. You can edit the charts too for color and whatever else you'd like to add on there. And so you can copy these pivot tables on it, as many times as you need to, and just manage the data in a way that works for you. But if you don't need to, then you can just manipulate the same pivot table that you were working with before. Do you guys have anything that you want to add or that I missed?
I think you touched on everything there. I think so only for my I guess what is it advice whenever we do pivot tables. Ariana and I actually work together. Go ahead.
I wanted to say Brianna has a question. She says, where are the charts options?
To edit the chart. So if you click on the chart, you'll see a third menu, design here. This is where you'll see all the options on what to do with the chart. Either change the layout, pick another chart that works better. Is that, I don't know if I answered.
It was answered, she said.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So the only thing I wanted to touch base on in terms of as pivot tables, Ariana actually went through all the concepts great here. We work together. So one of the things we always joke about is that every time we do a chart here, our first question is, what's the so what with this? So with these charts here, we have a specific point here. Like, our goal was to look at each of these products and figure out not only the sales, but the profitability. And I think everyone here is extremely smart people. So you actually know that when you're getting a chart or some sort, you're looking for a certain point. And it was more frustrating every time you get a chart and you have no clue what this chart's supposed to mean. When I teach a class, a lot of students give me a chart or a pivot table and they're like, isn't this great? And I'm like, so what does this mean? They're like, doesn't this look great? So so you have a few points where, yes, design is great. And you always actually want to make sure that everything makes sense, but always at your end result, make sure whatever you're showing actually makes sense. And whatever you're actually whatever your story is, whatever your point is trying to get across, make that part there. If you're actually, for this one, we're talking about profitability and sales. So we do this here. If we only wanted to focus on quantity, there would be no reason for us to include a profitability or sales thing. So, we don't ever want to make our charts too busy, but we actually don't want to keep adding too many things where it basically defeats the purpose of having a chart. So that's my only little advice on that part there.
Thank you. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, we can move, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Greg will go over the loan amortization table and the what if functions.
Okay.
Stop sharing here.
All right, so we're actually in our last half hour. So for my exercise, and we're gonna walk through this together as well. And I'm gonna make sure we do all the main points for all this. Let me actually get ready to share. But if any at a certain point we actually don't touch on based on all this, like Ariana mentioned, we're actually gonna give all the solutions to all this. And we may actually finish a little bit earlier to not actually go through every single point. So we actually can go through any other questions you have, not just related to our functions, pivot tables and charts, or this loan amortization, but to anything in general regarding Excel and any actual questions that you may have just popped in your head. So that being said, my topic is loan amortization, and I have a fun topic in that with Jurgen Ariona's topics, they are, Vlookup, there's a pivot tables, they are financial based, meaning like, a lot of people mainly use those to find a certain dollar amount or a certain reference point. You can use a Vlookup for, or a function or if function for anything. If you're trying to reference a certain phrase, or you're just trying to find something in this data, it never actually has to be words. So with my Vlookup, I could have just did a Vlookup to find a shipping mode of some sort. With our pivot tables, we could have used the pivot tables to just look for regions and what items they sell. It's useful to figure out the amount they sell and everything there, but it's all useful for, it doesn't need to be a numbers base. For my thing, unfortunately, for a loan amortization, it's purely dollar amounts. There's no other reason why you're going to use this loan amortization. You use loan amortization for the main reason because you are making a loan. You're buying something and you want to get a loan for it. So you can get a loan for a car, you can get a loan for a house, you can get a loan for a printer, but it's money. So I think from our overall topics, I think mine's the only one that's mainly specifically finance and nothing else finance. But let's look at this example for us here. And for this example, and to try to give a concept for our loan amortization, I'm pretty sure you all are used to having a credit card or even just buying a car, or more importantly, buying that house there. But whenever those situations comes up, you have the multiple options. You have the cost of the item. So for our example, it's a December to remember. If we ever remember those Lexus deals, we're keeping that mindset for us here. So for our example, for our loan amortization, we're going to imagine it's a local Lexus deal. We're thinking about buying that new Lexus LC, and the price point's at $92,950. And we're going to pay 10% of that as a down payment. And then the rest of it, we're going to finance it out with a 2.85% APR. And I have some of these parts here, but I'm actually going to remove all of these so we can walk through this part together so you can get a more understanding on what this loan amortization is, as well as how you can actually get this process here for us here. So with our loan amortization, and if you're actually thinking, why am I using this? I have an app for it. That's true. This loan amortization exercise, it's not reinventing the wheel. You can have an app for this. You can have an accountant for this. You can get these answers really quickly. But I think if you're ever in a situation where you're managing the finances, or let's say you're buying your house and you actually want to know how much is it going to cost me when I pay the 5th payment or the 20th payment or the 100th payment, and then when I pay that 100th payment, how much is my money going towards interest, and how much is actually lowering my my loan? This is the point of that loan amortization for us here. And if anyone has any questions or any comments, interrupt me. We're gonna go through this together. So I welcome the pop-ups, okay? So for this one here, we're gonna think about our car for us here. And we know from our exercise here that our car is gonna cost $92,950. First thing I noticed here, we talked on it a little bit for some of our exercises, is that right now it just looks like a number. I like to actually see everything as its current value. So I know this is the cost of a car, so I want to make sure this actually looks like a dollar bill. So there's multiple ways to format this cell to look like money or numbers. Under your home page, there's a bunch of shortcuts that you can actually just quickly change it. You can click this little box down here. It takes you to the format menu, or if you're actually to the actual cell, you can do little shortcut changes up here, but actually almost all cells, if you right click it, you can actually go to format cells, and then you can change that to however you want it to look. So for this one, I want it to look like currency. I want to make sure it looks like a dollar bill. And for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to keep the decimal points. I normally don't care about the pennies, but we're going to keep it on this one here. So 2 decimal points. So now it's the same exercise, but now I can actually see that this is $92,950. My next one here, down payments. We know our down payment is 10%. I'm in the rationale of, if you're a smart person and you know your money, you can just put in that, 10% of 92,950 is 9,029, whichever. But Excel, I'm in the fans of don't type any numbers in. Let Excel work for you. So instead of you actually just typing in the value, we're going to use a formula. We're going to do equals this cell times 0.1. That gives me my 10%. 0.1 works if you did 10%, gives you the same answer. No matter if you do a 0.1 or 10%, Excel will give you that same down payment. I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. So we have our APR. We see that's a 2.85%. Our number of years, our loan is going to be 5 years. And we didn't give all the information. So the biggest thing for a loan amortization, you got to figure out how many times are you going to pay per year. This doesn't mention any here, so we're going to assume that our periods are going to be 12. We're going to pay every month, so 12 periods per year. So these are our inputs based on our data here. And now we're going to work on our outputs. Our loan parts, present value, that means how much is our loan? We're buying a car at $92,950. We're giving a down payment at $9,295. So our loan is just going to be the difference of that. And like I said, we can do the math in our head and just type it in, but I loved using Excel references mainly because if you ever want to use this again and change the values, you don't have to do the calculation again in your head. You can just change the values right in that cell. So maybe if we decided this loan was, instead of being $92,950, we were splurging. We're buying a $150,000 car. Everything automatically changes on this side for us. So back to the first one. And then our number periods, we already know how many years our loan is going to be. We already know how many periods per year. So now that we do a simple product thing, we'll know that for the entire loan, we're going to have 60 periods where we pay this. All right, next is our periodic rates. I think everyone's familiar with APR. You ever buy anything, get a credit card, APR is that annual percentage rate. Periodic rate is helping us determine what is our interest per period. So when I pay in period 1, how much of that money is going to the interest? It's not going to be the annual one, and it's not as simple as just doing the annual and times dividing it by 12, because we have multiple periods here, multiple annuals here. So this is an actual, for this one, our periodic rate would be, I think this one just got my head. I think I may need to phone a friend. For my periodic rate, is that my?
It's your APR divided by 12.
That's so see, Occam's razor.
So the annual percentage rate and the periodic. So in our case, it's divided by 12. But if you're saying we're going to calculate quarterly payments, you divide it by 4. If you're saying semi-annual, you divide by 2. In this case, we're going to calculate the monthly payment, so you're dividing by 12.
Exactly. Yep. Thank you, Erin. I made it too complicated. Exactly. The periodic rate is just your current APR divided by the periods.
Since you have it there, yeah, I wanted to say it.
Yep. And our team loves these references. We never like just putting a number in the cell. So everyone's already telling me that you already have your annual thing. So don't type in 12 over here, 2.85. You already know your periods here. So don't type 12, Greg. Do your B6 over B8, because if you decide to change your periods, we don't want to do it annually. We want to do it quarterly. Boom, everything changes automatically. And then lastly, our payment function here, we're going to change this to an actual function in Excel that actually will determine, by giving all this information here, what is our actual payment per period. So this is a PMT function, and you know what? Just so you get used to it, I'm actually going to go up here to the function part here. And if you're ever trying to figure out which function is going to work for me, you can find it. You can either search for it, or you can just do you can type in what you're actually doing. So if I type in payments, it's going to give me all type of functions that are related to actual payments. And here's my payment function, and that's going to actually calculate my payment for the loan based on the interest. So I choose my function, and the first thing they're asking me is, what's my rate? And we're going to correct, we're not going to do the APR rate, we're going to do the periodic rate. So I'm going to tell Excel to go to E6, my number of periods, not number of periods per year or number of years, how many periods am I going to have in this loan? 60. My present value, what's my current cost of my loan? 83,665. And if you can notice here, everything after here, it's not bolded. It's not, these are all extras. You can, if you have your loan and you know what the future value is, you can put this part here. If you have the calculation of a loan payment, or there's different parts here that you can more, I guess, expand.
They're optional.
Optional, but they're not necessary. So you can definitely finish up without actually having.
And before you, sorry, Greg, before you click OK, I was just going to say that we calculated the basic output in column E, but we can actually type under rate. You could set up a formula there to say, to calculate the rate by dividing B6 with a number with 12, with B8, right? So we did it on column E, but you could.
Yes, yeah. So we actually put out everything here, but you could put everything, your calculations through here. So even though we made everything in this cell, everything you made in this cell, you could have just did it the long way inside here. But we kind of working through this a little bit longer so you can actually see our steps and what this step ties to this step and from that step ties to that step. And I thought I saw and from your future value, your future value will be 0, but Excel's automatically
it defaults, yeah, it defaults to 0.
They're assuming that your future value will be 0. So no need to actually, and if you put that, I'm pretty sure if we did let's test it out, because I actually would like to be wrong if that doesn't do it. So yeah, Excel is assuming it's going to be 0, but so you don't have to put that there. If you put it there, no skin off your back.
Did you want to explain why the number is negative?
So negative, and actually you might be able to help me out here. So from my aspect, Excel considers considers its money, it's a cost to you. So they're using that as a negative here for us. So whenever we're actually looking at for this actual experience, because it's a depreciation, or actually not appreciated, but it's a deduction, they can classify it as a negative. You have any? Is there a different?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say this is, so if you use the insert function box and you select financial, you're going to see all the formulas that are under financial. And these formulas, all of them distinguish between cash outflows and cash inflows. And cash outflows all default to negative numbers are formatted as red and in parentheses, and then positive numbers are black. And so that's why. So this is a cash outflow out of the borrower's pocket, and so it's a negative number.
Exactly. And so I think only thing with that one, and this exactly tells you exactly what it is. Only thing with that one, I would say be careful whenever you're making any tables when it's a negative, when the numbers are either a negative or a positive. If you look at your bank account, you probably notice that money come in and is in a negative. So there are certain scenarios where when you make a report or you do some type of analysis, some people are expecting the revenue to be in a negative, or some people, if they're looking at a cash basis, they expect the expense to be in a negative. There is no wrong answer. It's just whatever your decision is, make sure you stay consistent in whatever you're actually presenting. So we spend a lot of time up here, but this is actually so we can get all the details so we can do this part here. We're gonna walk through this a little bit quickly, but once we finish our first row, everything else is gonna tie in pretty fast. So our first column here is asking for a payment number, and we're gonna make this payment 60 times. So I want a cell to go from I want each row to have 1 through 60. And multiple ways to do this again. I can type in 1, 2, 3, and go all the way to 60, but I'm pretty lazy. I don't feel like doing it that way. I can do a 1 and 2, and Excel is also pretty smart, and they can actually say, if you drag it down, you can just keep on going until you get to 60. And that works for me too, but I want to figure out better options, because what if I didn't want this to be a 60 period loan? It was a 360 period loan. I don't want to go through all the way that far down. So one more option here is that if I go and just click on cell 1, I'm going to go all the way over here to my fill. And in this fill, there is a series option. This option here is going to basically fill everything for me automatically. And I can say when to stop, and I can actually tell them how often do I want the change increment to go up. So this is a series. I'm going to go to columns, because I want all my data is going to be in the column. My step value, I'm going to go by 1. If I wanted it to go by 2s, next one will be 3, 5, 7. I can do that, but I want each row to have only go up by 1. And then I'm automatically tell them to say, I want you to stop at 60. If I wanted them to stop at 50, I can do whatever. I would be careful because if I don't put a stop value here, Excel just keeps going, and Excel has about 10 million lines. So make sure you put something there or you'll be waiting a pretty good time for Excel. So we have our step value, we're over 60. Everything on this other side, it's a linear, so I'm gonna leave that as default. And now, if I go to Excel, it's automatically going 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm gonna go all the way down to 60 and it stopped automatically for me. It's one way to get to there. It's not the absolute right way. If you wanted to actually do it manually, that's optional as well here for you. All right, so for here, next option, they're asking for my beginning balance. My first payment, my beginning balance is the first payment, so whatever my loan is. So I'm going to do it equals. I love referencing the cells, so I'm going to go here. And it doesn't matter for this exercise, but just to be safe, I'm going to lock this in because I don't want, if I happen to have to drag this down, I don't want it to go to the next cell down, but it's not really a factor for this exercise, but you know what, I'm safer than sorry. Next one's asking for the monthly payment.
So can you, sorry to interrupt you, can you say how you lock it, like the shortcut?
Yes, thank you, because I jump around before I even figure out that part there. So locking in, I will do my equals and multiple options here for us. If you, for mine on my PC side, we click F4 and it automatically does it for us. Clicking F4 once will automatically make it absolute. Absolute means that whenever, however you move this cell anywhere else, it's always going to reference E4. And then the next ones are a mix. So that means that I'm going to make sure I stay in row 4. But if you move different columns, I'm going to move to whatever column in reference to you do. And then the next one is the difference, is the opposite. I'm going to stay in column E, but if you go up and down to a different row, I'm going to change to reference that. There is a Mac version, and Mac versions are not memorized. I'm going to make, I will, before we finish and we give you all the answers, I'll make sure we have a few tips and tricks on on Mac versus PC shortcuts. But for a PC, you just do F4, or you can do it manually as well. You could just put in the $sign before the column locks it in, a $sign before the number locks it in, and you're done. We just know the shortcuts as well for this one here. Monthly payments, we already have the monthly payment up here. So I'm just going to reference this. This is always going to be that cell, so I'm going to lock that in. Interest paid is an actual another function here. And we're going to use our handy dandy walkthrough here. And we, like I said before, you can go through the function part up here, but instead I know I'm going to use this I payment. It's a payment, but they're looking for the interest. And it says right here, returns the interest payment for a given period. The next one we're going to go through is going to give us the principal payment, but for this scenario, for this cell, we just want the interest payment. So I'm going to click OK. First question they're always going to ask me is, what is the rate? The periodic rate is there. This cell is going to move around, so I want this to stay locked in. The period, what is the total periods for this loan? There's going to be 60 periods for this loan, so I'm going to click this. That's going to stay locked in because it's always going to reference that cell. And actually, I'm sorry, I flipped it around. This is actually asking for the period of your current payment. We're in payment 1, so I want this to reference this cell here. This is actually going to move around. This is actually going to, every time we go down a cell, I wanted to reference this, the row it's in, so I'm not going to lock this one in. My other answer, where it's asking the number of periods, what are all the total periods in our loan? 60, lock that in. And then the present value of the loan is 83,665. We're going to go up here. It's always going to be that amount, so we're going to lock this in. Once we're done, everything like I said before, everything else after here is optional. I don't feel like doing it, so 0. And I'm going to go through this ones, and then we'll explain what each of these mean here for us. So we add the interest paid. I'm going to do the principal payments. Again, our rate is here. Lock it in. Our period is 1. We're not going to lock that one in. Number of periods, 60. Lock that one. Our value of the loan is 83. Lock that. Finish up. So while we're looking at this, we have a loan that costs, and we're the first payment of our loan. The current balance is 83 because we haven't paid anything yet. Our monthly payment is $1,497. That's always going to be our amount for the entire loan. That's never going to change. Interest paid, that's going to change depending on each payment. Every time we pay, the money that's going to the interest is going to get deducted a little bit. Principal payment is going to be opposite. Every time we make a payment, more money is going to go towards the principal here for us. So now that we're at the ending balance, I usually test my students with this, but I'm going to give an answer here. Our ending balance is going to be our beginning balance minus the principal. It's not going to be the monthly payment. It's not going to be the interest, because as we all, if you all are any familiar with your interest for your credit cards, your homes, or whatever, or your mortgage, that interest is your fee. That's the money it costs for you to get the loan. I'm making my fix here because I'm so used to having things in regular values. I didn't realize because I have my payment as a negative, if I want that to be deducted, because I did a B11 minus a negative, it's a minus a negative, it's essentially a plus. So I want this to deduct, so I'm gonna say plus. And now if I look at my value, my first value was 83,665. I paid 1,000. Of that 1,497, 198 went to my interest. 1,298 went to actually lowering my my loan balance. So now at the end of my first period, I'm at 82,356. Flip it around. And I apologize if I'm going a little fast here, but please let me know if you want me to go back on another topic here. But I'm going to finish this part and then we can actually come together for more questions here. But so for my second payment here, my ending balance of period payment 1 is my second payment for period 2. So I can just reference that. That is the only thing that's different between row 1 and row 2, payment 1 and payment 2. Everything else here is going to be exactly the same. So the benefit of me locking this in is that when I now double click this, I can double click, I can drag it down, but any way I do this, it's going to go all the way to my last payment. My interest, the formula for my interest is always going to be the same. And the good thing is I locked everything that needed to be locked in, and I didn't lock in anything that needed to change depending on the row. So now if I double click this.
Hey, Greg.
Yes.
Instead of dragging them down one by one, why don't you complete all of the second payment row?
Ah, absolutely.
And then select all the cells and drag them all down at the same time.
Yep. So
it's more magical that way.
See, great. You love how it all fits together. So we're going to do a little bit step by step. So I said for the second payment, this is going to be exactly like that one. So I can either do a copy or paste, or Control V. I can actually use the manual paste. You can use that little box there to drag. Multiple options, do a copy and paste, but however get you to the finish line works there. Same thing for this one. Just going to drag that, so it'll be the same. Same thing for this one. And this one is going to be referencing the same. I didn't lock anything in, so when I drag this down, now the formula references the ones in this row. So now the magic that Ariel was talking about is that now that I have everything that needs to be done, my beginning balance is always going to reference the previous period's ending balance. All these are all set. I can select my cells here. And now if I double click this, everything goes all the way. We're going to keep seeing money go down. If you're looking at the trend, our interest is getting lower and lower. We started paying at $180, $198 a month. Then a few periods later, next year it was $164. Then it was $106, all the way down to our last payment was $3.55. And on the opposite side of our payments, we started paying, or we paid the same amount every month, but our principal started with just $1,298. Each period, more of our payment went towards the principal. Each payment, more money went to actually lowering our loan. So it goes lower and lower and lower and lower. So at the bottom, we see that our payment is this. So now let's figure out how we can actually total all this, and different ways for us to total this here. I can just do a plus, but like I said before, I'm lazy. I hope Excel has a faster function here for me. So Excel does, and there's an equal sum. And this equal sum will add everything in here for me here. And
Greg, when you get a chance, can you freeze the labels so we can see?
I can. See, if everyone's here, I did the cardinal sin of not freezing my header. And with the freeze, and if anyone's familiar, I'm sorry, I have a lot of shortcuts here that makes everything without actually going to the part here. But if you see here, we're scrolling down, we're losing what's these headers here for us. So what Ariel's mentioned is that why don't we lock in this thing so that when I scroll down, you're always going to see rows 1 through 10. So how I do that is I go to the cell that the last cell that I want to stay locked in, I go to the cell underneath that, and I'm gonna go to view. In this view part, there's a freeze panes option. And in this freeze panes option, I'm gonna click freeze panes. And there, so now that I have that, every time I scroll down, rows 1 through 10 stay, but every time I scroll down, it just keeps rolling and rolling. So you notice it goes from 10 to 56, 10 to 59. So now you can see everything here. So we want to add everything up here. I can do a sum, and the sum basically adds everything for me. I can basically select the cell I wanted to add, and I can highlight them all. The Excel actually can do something even quicker than that. I can actually, and like I said, I'm gonna find that another Mac shortcut. But for our PCs, if we do an Alt, if we hold the Alt key and then the equal sign, it automatically sums everything in that column area for you. And it automatically knows when to start and when to stop. And you know, Excel's magical. It knows that the cell C10 is as a word, so don't include it. So now that we have that there, we add it up and we see that our entire, we paid a total of $89,856. That doesn't sound like my loan, but let's add it. Let's look at the other options here. I'm gonna do a sum for my interest. Interest 6,201. Let's do one more sum for my principal.
So you have another shortcut for sum. If you go to a home page, you have the Autosum.
Yep. So yeah, these are way more, the Autosum up here. So if you're looking for different options to add things together, I think we can all give you multiple options here. I think at least, I think each of us can at least give you 2 different ways to do a sum. But if you're saying, if one of you is sitting there saying, that's not how I sum it together, you're not wrong. So thanks, sir. You said the Autosum. So the Autosum will do that same thing I did. I have a keyboard function for it, or you can actually just type it in doing sum. Or if you have a lot of time on your hands, you can literally just say equals E70 plus E69 plus E89. I don't recommend that, but it's an option for you to get the sum. So if we look at here, we have all of our sums here. We notice that we paid a grand total of $89,856. Our interest was $6,201, and our principal was $83,655. Adding these two together, I'm gonna do one more sum, or at least this plus this, just so we can see the difference here. If I look how much I pay for interest and principal, how much I pay for interest, these two numbers equal. So I realized that, yes, my loan was for $83,000, but I paid $6,000 in interest, which means for my $83,000 loan, out of 60 periods, I paid a total of $89,000. We only have a few more minutes left, so I want to stop here for anyone that has questions. We have a few other parts here that is a cumulative interest. So that's for this, I'm going to not spend time on this one because it's a little bit walk through this one. But if you look at our solution, you'll see that the point of this one is to see how much you've paid grand total to date. So for this one, we would see that for period 2, it would add all the interest for these 2 periods. So function that will just say, I'm going to add these 2. And if let's say I wanted to go to 34, it will give me the interest for all the payment periods up to that date. Same thing for the principal. So that if you have a scenario saying, in period 40, how much interest did I pay? This is the point of the cumulative interest. We're going to have that on the solution sheet for you. So feel free to take a look at that. I'm going to make sure you have any questions. And then our last one, this one takes a bit more time. We have a solution for this one as well. We have the whole point of this one is to give us the idea on the cost of the car, the actual of a specific loan for a specific APR amount over a certain amount of time. When we actually want to change any of those variables, and we actually wanted to say, I don't want to pay, I want to see my options for APR. I don't want to go through all the exercises. Give me a variable table that shows me how much all my interest, my monthly payment, and my principal will be if I change my APR from 2.85 to maybe 1.85, or maybe, I have a pretty bad debt, so it moved over to 3.85. This is a 1 variable table. Then we have a 2 variable table that shows, what if I want to change my APR and the cost of the home? How much will I pay a month? That's our 2 variable table. And then lastly, we have a goal seek that says, you know what? I just want to pay $1,200 a month. How much do I need to pay for a down payment to change that? This is our goal seek. these are a lot of finance things, and we can spend more time on this one, but I don't want, we're hitting our mark here, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. So we're going to make sure we show this these solutions for you. But if you have any questions right now, I think we're going to finish up. But any questions here, everyone? This was a lot here, but but if not, I think we are at this. We're at the benchmark. Everyone's hitting that 6:30 time, but if there hasn't been, I'm let Jürgen and Ariana finish up. But it's been a pleasure, you all. I hope there was a lot of financial, a lot of Excel information. We are well aware that this Excel thing doesn't give you, it's too much to take in at a regular time. Benefit of Excel, it's like a car. You need to drive to actually get the use of it. You can't just get your license and 10 years later think you're going to go on a road trip. So make sure you keep these skills here. Use any exercises, come to any of these labs so you can actually, test them out. But as long as you're working on it regularly, it'll be like muscle memory.
Thank you all. Thank you for joining. Take care.
Thank you.
All right, if not, take care. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye.